With iron chains cutting into her swollen wrists, Morning Star watched the weathered cowboy empty his life savings to purchase her freedom while her unborn child kicked within her belly. Her father's 100 warriors were already racing toward them with weapons drawn, each man determined to bathe his blade in the blood of her supposed captor. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust swirled across Redemption Creek's main street, carried by a hot wind that seemed to whisper warnings to those wise enough to listen. Ezekiel Turner was not among them. At 58, he'd long since stopped heeding omens or believing in anything beyond what his weathered hands could touch and his faded blue eyes could see. Time had carved deep lines into his sun-leathered face, each wrinkle a chapter of a life spent under unforgiving skies. He sat atop his dun-colored mare, Mercy, surveying the ramshackle town with the detached interest of a man who had seen too many frontier settlements rise and fall to find anything remarkable in their existence. Redemption Creek was like dozens of others, a collection of wooden structures clinging to the edge of civilization, promising salvation but delivering mostly sin. "Come on, girl," he murmured to Mercy, nudging her forward with his knee. "Let's get our supplies and be gone before sundown." The street was alive with the usual activity, cowboys fresh off the trail looking for whiskey and companionship, merchants hawking wares from dusty storefronts, and the steady stream of hopeful souls moving west with dreams bigger than their wagons could carry. Ezekiel moved through it all like a ghost, unseen and unnoticed, just as he preferred. He tethered Mercy outside the general store, patting her neck with affection reserved only for his horse. The bell above the door announced his entrance, though few patrons glanced his way. Inside, he nodded to Wilbur Jenkins, the store's proprietor, a man whose friendly smile masked the calculations always running behind his eyes. "Turner," Jenkins acknowledged. "Thought you might have died out there in that cabin of yours." "Not yet," Ezekiel replied, his voice gravel and whiskey from years of disuse. "Though not for lack of trying," Jenkins chuckled, a hollow sound that matched the emptiness of the exchange. "The usual." Ezekiel nodded, watching as Jenkins began gathering his monthly supplies: coffee, flour, beans, ammunition, and tobacco. While he waited, his gaze drifted to the window, where he caught sight of unusual activity down the street. A crowd was gathering outside Harlan's trading post, a place Ezekiel avoided for its reputation of dealing in more than just furs and trinkets. "What's happening at Harlan's?" he asked, not particularly interested but filling the silence. Jenkins' eyes gleamed with the light of gossip. "Special auction today. Caught themselves a Cheyenne woman, young one too." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Been a while since we had fresh Indian stock come through." The words hit Ezekiel like a physical blow, forcing air from his lungs. Memories he'd spent years drowning in whiskey suddenly surfaced. Memories of raids and ropes, of women and children treated as spoils of war during his time as an army scout. He had never participated, but he had watched, and his silence had made him complicit. "You all right there, Turner?" Jenkins asked, noticing the sudden pallor beneath Ezekiel's tan. "Fine," he managed, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "Just finish up the supplies." Outside, the crowd's noise swelled, punctuated by jeers and laughter. Against his better judgment, Ezekiel moved to the window for a clearer view. Through the dusty glass, he saw a young native woman being displayed on a crude platform. Her long black hair was matted, her buckskin dress torn and dirty, but it was her eyes that captured him, dark, defiant, alive with a fire that refused to be extinguished despite the chains binding her wrists. And then he saw what made his old heart stutter, the gentle swell of her belly beneath the dress. She was with child. How much for my supplies? Ezekiel asked abruptly, turning from the window. Jenkins finished tallying. $12.33. Ezekiel reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the leather pouch that contained nearly all his worldly wealth, savings from years of isolation and hard work. It wasn't much, but it was his security, his independence. "I'll be back," he said suddenly, heading for the door. "Your supplies," Jenkins began. "Keep them here." And then Ezekiel was gone, stepping into the hot afternoon with purpose in his stride for the first time in years. The crowd at Harlan's had grown, perhaps 20 men forming a loose circle around the platform where the woman stood. A man Ezekiel recognized as Silas Harlan, the trading post's owner, was calling out her attributes like she was livestock. "Strong back, good teeth," Harlan proclaimed, grabbing the woman's face roughly to display her features. "Still young enough to serve for many years, and soon to provide an extra pair of hands with that belly of hers." The woman's expression never changed, though Ezekiel noticed how she protectively curved one hand over her stomach when Harlan's attention shifted. "Starting the bidding at $50, Harlan announced. "Who'll give me 50 for this fine specimen?" Hands began to rise, voices calling out bids that increased by small increments. Ezekiel felt sick, the bile rising in his throat as he watched men, some he'd nodded to in passing for years, bid on a human being as casually as they would a horse. $100, called a voice Ezekiel knew belonged to James Wilson, owner of the largest cattle operation in the territory. Wilson was known for working his hands to death, white or otherwise. The bidding continued, reaching $120 before stalling. Harlan looked disappointed. "Come now, gentlemen, she's worth twice that, especially with the bonus coming in a few months." Wilson smirked. "130, and that's my final offer." Harlan looked around the crowd, seeking higher bids. Going once, Ezekiel felt his feet moving before his mind fully formed the thought. Going twice? He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the curses of those he shoved aside. $200, Ezekiel said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering. Harlan's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Turner, didn't know you had interest in such." "Domestic matters. 200, Ezekiel repeated firmly, meeting the auctioneer's gaze without blinking. Wilson turned, measuring Ezekiel with cold eyes. 225. 300, Ezekiel countered immediately. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Few men in Redemption Creek could afford such a sum, especially not a solitary rancher like Turner. Wilson's face darkened. "You best reconsider, old man. You're bidding against the wrong person." Ezekiel ignored him, keeping his eyes on Harlan. $300, cash in hand. Do you want it or not? For the first time, the young woman's expression changed, her eyes shifting to Ezekiel with a mixture of confusion and the faintest glimmer of something that might have been hope. Harlan licked his lips, greed warring with caution. Wilson was a regular customer, but $300 was $300. Sold to Ezekiel Turner for $300. A heavy silence fell over the crowd as Ezekiel reached into his pocket and withdrew his life savings. The leather pouch felt lighter with each step he took toward Harlan, who watched him with the hungry eyes of a coyote. Behind Harlan, two men with rifles stood guard, their expressions blank but their knuckles white against their weapons. They were Harlan's muscle, brothers named Earl and Virgil Cobb, known for their willingness to spill blood for the right price. Ezekiel counted out the money, laying each note deliberately on the small table beside the platform. $300, the boundary between him and destitution, now surrendered for a woman whose name he didn't even know. "It's all there," he said, stepping back. "Now, release her." Harlan scooped up the money with practiced efficiency, thumbing through the bills with a smirk. "Never figured you for an Indian lover, Turner." "I'm not a lover of anything," Ezekiel replied, his voice flat. "Just get on with it." From the edge of the crowd, James Wilson pushed forward, his expensive boots kicking up dust with each deliberate step. Two of his ranch hands flanked him, their hands hovering near their sidearms. "This is a mistake, Harlan," Wilson called out. "I've been a good customer for years. You gonna let this hermit outbid me?" Harlan's smile faltered slightly. "Business is business, Wilson." "Turner paid top dollar." Wilson turned his attention to Ezekiel, his eyes cold beneath the brim of his hat. "What's a man like you want with her anyway? You can barely take care of yourself out in that shack of yours." Ezekiel met Wilson's gaze without flinching. "Not your concern." "I'm making it my concern." Wilson moved closer, the scent of expensive cologne and whiskey preceding him. "Dude, I think you're buying her just to spite me, and I don't take kindly to being crossed." A tense silence descended. Even the saloon across the street seemed to quiet, as if the whole town was holding its breath. Ezekiel's hand didn't move toward his gun, though he was acutely aware of its weight against his hip. "You've had too much to drink, Wilson," Ezekiel said evenly. "Go home." Wilson's face reddened. You don't tell me what to..." "Problem here, gentlemen." Sheriff Dawson's voice cut through the tension as he approached, thumbs hooked in his belt. Malcolm Dawson was a man who preferred maintaining peace through intimidation rather than action, his badge more symbol than substance. "No problem," Harlan interjected quickly. "Just completing a transaction. Mr. Turner here has purchased this woman, fair and square." Dawson's gaze swept over the scene, lingering on the chained woman before settling on Ezekiel. "That right, Turner. Didn't think you were the type to keep slaves." "I'm not," Ezekiel replied. "I'm taking her off the chain now." Something flickered in Dawson's eyes, disapproval perhaps, or concern, but he merely shrugged. "Your money, your business." "Just keep any trouble outside my town," Wilson stepped forward. "This isn't over, Turner." "It is for today," Sheriff Dawson said firmly. "Move along, Wilson. You too, folks. Show's over." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, though Wilson and his men lingered, watching with undisguised hostility. Harlan signaled to Virgil Cobb, who produced a key and moved toward the young woman. "You understand she's property now," Harlan said to Ezekiel. "What you do with her is your affair, but if she runs, don't come crying to me for a refund." Ezekiel didn't dignify that with a response. He watched as Virgil unlocked the chains from the woman's wrists, revealing angry red welts beneath. When freed, she rubbed her wrists slowly, her dark eyes darting between the men surrounding her, calculating. "Oh, come with me," Ezekiel said to her, gesturing toward the steps leading down from the platform. She didn't move. "She doesn't speak English," Harlan said with a smirk. "Good luck with that." Ezekiel took a deep breath, searching his memory for the few Cheyenne words he'd learned years ago. "Neheshe," he said awkwardly. "Friend." The woman's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but her expression remained guarded. Still, after a moment's hesitation, she slowly descended the steps, keeping a careful distance from him. "I need to get my supplies," Ezekiel told her, pointing toward the general store. "Then we'll leave." She gave no indication of understanding, but followed a few paces behind as he made his way back to Jenkins' store. Inside, the shopkeeper's eyes nearly bulged from his head when he saw who accompanied Ezekiel. "Good Lord, Turner, you actually bought her." "My supplies ready?" Ezekiel asked, ignoring the question. Jenkins scrambled to gather the items, stealing glances at the native woman who stood silently by the door, her hand once again protectively covering her belly. When Jenkins handed over the bundle, Ezekiel paid the remaining balance, now painfully aware of how little he had left. Outside, Ezekiel loaded the supplies onto Mercy, securing them with practiced efficiency. The young woman watched him warily, her body tense as if ready to flee at the first opportunity. "You'll ride," Ezekiel told her, patting the saddle. When she didn't respond, he made a mounting gesture, then pointed to her. Understanding dawned in her eyes, but she shook her head firmly, one hand still on her stomach. "You need to ride," Ezekiel insisted. "And it's a long walk to my place." Their silent impasse was broken by the sound of boots on the boardwalk. Earl Cobb approached, a rifle cradled in his arms and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Harlan wants me to give you some advice," Earl said, stopping a few feet away. "That savage is carrying the child of her chief's son. Black Thunder is her father, meanest Cheyenne war chief this side of the mountains." Ezekiel stiffened. Black Thunder was a name he knew well from his scouting days, a formidable leader whose band had resisted displacement with remarkable effectiveness. "Harlan thought you should know what you're getting into," Earl continued. "Her village was raided 3 days ago. Most were killed, but she was taken special. Word is, Black Thunder survived. If he learns his daughter is here..." Earl let the implication hang in the air. The woman's eyes had narrowed at the mention of Black Thunder, the only words she seemed to recognize. "Appreciate the warning," Ezekiel said tersely. "Now step aside." Earl chuckled. "Sure thing, Turner. Just don't be surprised if your little rescue brings a war party down on this whole territory." He turned and sauntered away, still laughing. Ezekiel looked at the woman with new understanding. "A morning star," he said quietly, the name coming to him from some half-remembered report. "Your morning star." She lifted her chin at the sound of her name, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. In that gaze, Ezekiel saw not just defiance, but intelligence, pride, and the silent acknowledgement of a truth they both now shared. They were bound together in something far more dangerous than either had anticipated. They left Redemption Creek as the sun began its descent behind the jagged mountain peaks, painting the sky in violent strokes of orange and crimson. Ezekiel led Mercy by the reins, walking steadily despite his age, while Morning Star followed several paces behind. The young woman's footsteps were nearly silent against the hard-packed dirt, a stark contrast to Ezekiel's boots and the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves. Every few minutes, Ezekiel glanced back, half expecting to find her gone, vanished into the tall grass that flanked the narrow trail. But each time, she was there, her face impassive, dark eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The only sign of her fatigue was an occasional hand pressed against the small of her back, supporting the weight of her growing child. "You should ride," Ezekiel said for the third time, gesturing to Mercy. Morning Star shook her head, pointing to the supplies already burdening the mare. "Jose," she said, her first spoken word since they'd left town. Ezekiel understood enough to know she meant the horse was already carrying enough. He didn't press further, respecting the quiet dignity in her refusal. As they crested a small rise, Ezekiel stopped and pointed to a distant smudge against the landscape, barely visible in the fading light. "Home," he said. Morning Star followed his gesture, studying the isolated cabin with careful consideration. Her eyes then methodically traced the perimeter, the crude corral, the small garden patch, the shed leaning precariously to one side, and beyond that, nothing but open country for miles. Her expression revealed nothing, but Ezekiel sensed her assessment. This place offered little protection. They continued in silence until the cabin loomed before them, weathered logs turned silver by years of sun and rain. It wasn't much, a single room with a stone chimney, a lean-to addition that served as storage, and a covered porch where Ezekiel spent most evenings watching the sun disappear. "Not fancy," he said as he led Mercy to the corral, "but it's quiet." Morning Star remained by the path, her body tense. She stared at the darkening landscape behind them, then up at the first stars appearing in the twilight sky. Ezekiel unloaded his supplies, removed Mercy's saddle, and gave the horse a quick brush down before providing fresh water. When he finished, Morning Star still hadn't moved from her spot. "You can come inside," he said, gesturing toward the cabin door, "or stay out here if you prefer." "I won't force you either way." He struck a match and lit the lantern hanging by the door, casting a warm glow across the porch. Then he gathered his supplies and went inside, leaving the door ajar behind him. The cabin's interior was sparse but meticulously ordered. A cast-iron stove occupied one corner, a narrow cot the other. A rough-hewn table with two mismatched chairs stood in the center, while shelves lined the walls, holding books, tools, and provisions. A rifle hung above the door, and beneath the single window sat a trunk that contained what few personal items Ezekiel had retained through his solitary years. He busied himself lighting the stove and preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork, deliberately keeping his movements slow and predictable. Through the open door, he could see Morning Star still standing outside, silhouetted against the deepening blue of evening. The aroma of cooking food eventually drew her closer, though she remained at the threshold, one hand braced against the doorframe. Ezekiel spooned portions onto two tin plates without comment, then placed one on the table farthest from where he sat. "Eat," he said, gesturing to the food. "But need strength." She hesitated, hunger warring with suspicion. Finally, necessity won out. She entered cautiously, her eyes never leaving him as she took the plate and retreated to the corner farthest from Ezekiel. She ate standing, her back against the wall, watching his every move. Ezekiel ate slowly, deliberately avoiding direct eye contact to ease her discomfort. When he finished, he set his plate aside and reached for a battered leather-bound journal from one of the shelves. He opened it, flipping through pages covered in neat, compact handwriting until he found what he was looking for. "Cheyenne," he said, tapping the page. "Been a long time." Morning Star tilted her head slightly, curious despite herself. Ezekiel cleared his throat. "Atsemahe nevestahe," he said carefully, the unfamiliar syllables clumsy on his tongue. "I mean no harm." Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She set down her empty plate and replied with a stream of words too rapid for him to catch. Ezekiel shook his head. Slowly, "Nepave hoe." "Slow." "Nehesha?" she asked cautiously. "Friend." "He," he nodded. Yes. A flicker of something, not trust, but perhaps a lessening of fear crossed her face. She moved slightly away from the wall. The moment was broken by Mercy's sudden whinny from the corral, a sound of alarm that made both humans stiffen. Ezekiel was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a man half his age. Morning Star had already melted into the shadows by the door, a knife he hadn't known she possessed, now gleaming in her hand. "Stay here," he whispered, taking down the rifle. But she was already moving, sliding silently onto the porch, her body low and balanced despite her pregnancy. Ezekiel followed, rifle raised, scanning the darkness beyond the lantern's glow. Nothing moved in the immediate vicinity, but Mercy continued to pace nervously in her enclosure, ears pricked toward the distant tree line. Then Ezekiel saw it. Just a flash. There and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. The reflection of moonlight on something metal among the trees, perhaps half a mile distant. Morning Star had seen it too. "No tax," she whispered. "My people." Ezekiel glanced at her sharply. There was no joy in her voice, only tension, the wary recognition of hunters on the trail. "How many?" he asked, forgetting she wouldn't understand. But she held up her hands, fingers splayed. 10. Then she did it again. 20. She dropped her hands and shook her head, indicating uncertainty. "Many." Ezekiel moved quickly, extinguishing the lantern with a decisive puff of breath. Darkness enveloped them, broken only by slivers of moonlight filtering through the cabin's single window. He motioned Morningstar back inside, closing the door with barely a sound. "They won't approach tonight," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Just scouts, assessing." Morningstar stood in the center of the room, knife still gripped tightly, her silhouette barely visible in the dim glow from the stove's vents. She said something in Cheyenne, her voice low and urgent. Ezekiel shook his head, frustrated by the barrier between them. He moved to his trunk, opened it, and retrieved a worn map, spreading it on the table. Using the faint light from the stove, he pointed to their location, then made a circular motion with his finger, indicating the surrounding area. "Where?" he asked, pointing to the trees where they'd seen movement, then to the map. Morningstar hesitated, then approached cautiously. She studied the map, her intelligence evident in the quick assessment of the unfamiliar document. After a moment, she touched a spot north of their position, then swept her hand eastward in an arc. "They're coming from the north, moving east," Ezekiel translated aloud, "searching for you." She met his gaze steadily, then touched her chest. "Morningstar," she said clearly. Then, with effort in heavily accented English, "Father, come." Ezekiel nodded, a chill settling in his bones that had nothing to do with the night air. If Black Thunder was leading the search personally, their situation was even more precarious than he'd thought. He gestured to the cot. "Sleep," he said. "I'll watch." Morningstar shook her head firmly, pointing to herself, then to the window. She would take first watch. Too tired to argue, Ezekiel nodded, though he had no intention of sleeping deeply. He settled into a chair positioned to view both the door and the window, his rifle across his lap. Morningstar took her place by the window, a shadow among shadows. Despite his resolve, exhaustion claimed him. His chin dropped to his chest, and the darkness behind his closed eyes became the darkness of memory. Rain fell in sheets, turning the ground to sucking mud that pulled at horses, hooves, and men's boots alike. Lieutenant Hargrove's detachment moved through the downpour with grim determination, guided by their scout, a younger Ezekiel Turner, lean and hard-eyed beneath his dripping hat. "There," Ezekiel pointed to a cluster of teepees nestled in a small valley. "That's the band we've been tracking." Hargrove squinted through the rain. "You're certain these are the ones who raided the Henderson homestead?" "No," Ezekiel admitted. "Wrong hunting grounds for that group. These folks are peaceful. Been trading with Fort Laramie all season." The lieutenant's face hardened. "Orders were clear, Turner. Any hostiles in this territory are to be addressed." "These aren't hostiles," Ezekiel insisted, a sick feeling growing in his gut. "That's not for you to decide." Hargrove turned to his sergeant. "Prepare the men." What followed played out in horrific flashes, gunfire cutting through the rain, screams rising above the thunder, teepees burning despite the downpour, women and children running only to fall under cavalry sabers. And Ezekiel, frozen atop his horse, neither participating nor preventing the slaughter. A young woman, no older than 17, clutching a baby to her chest, locked eyes with him as she ran past his position. He could have stopped her, could have turned her over to the soldiers. Instead, he looked away, deliberately focusing on the distant hills as she disappeared into the brush. Later, as the detachment regrouped among the smoking ruins, Hargrove approached him. "Good work finding them. Turner, 23 confirmed kills." "They weren't the raiders," Ezekiel said hollowly. Hargrove shrugged. "One less band to worry about either way. Let's move out." That night, Ezekiel left his post, riding away from the army, from the war, from the man he'd become. He never scouted again. Ezekiel jerked awake, a gasp catching in his throat. Morning Star stood over him, one hand lightly touching his shoulder. In the faint light, he could see concern etched across her features. "Mesh queso?" she asked softly. "Bad dream?" He nodded, disoriented by how easily she'd read him. "Bad dream," he echoed, his voice rough. She studied him for a long moment, then said slowly in her limited English, "You cry." Ezekiel touched his cheek, surprised to find it wet. He wiped the moisture away quickly, embarrassed. "Just an old man's ghosts," he muttered. Morning Star didn't move away. Instead, she touched her own chest, then pointed to him. "Same," she said. Then she made a gesture, like rifles firing, and shook her head sadly. The simple communication pierced him more deeply than any eloquent speech could have. She recognized the haunted look of someone who had witnessed atrocity because she carried the same burden. "I'm sorry," he said, the inadequate words heavy with decades of unspoken regret. Morning Star held his gaze, neither accepting nor rejecting his apology. After a moment, she returned to her position by the window. Dawn was breaking, pale light seeping through the trees. The night had passed without incident, but both knew it was merely a reprieve. Ezekiel rose stiffly, his old bones protesting the night spent in a chair. He moved to the stove and rekindled the fire, putting coffee on to boil. As he worked, he noticed Morning Star watching him with a new intensity, her eyes tracking his movements, as if reassessing everything she thought she knew about this white man who had purchased her freedom only to protect her through the night. "Your father," Ezekiel said, turning to face her fully. "How many days?" He held up one finger, then two, then three, questioning. Morning Star considered, then raised two fingers. "Etus," she said in English. Then she added something in Cheyenne, pointing first to herself, then making a sweeping motion toward the horizon. Ezekiel thought he understood. Black Thunder would find her, no matter how long it took or how far they ran. The question wasn't if, but when, and what would happen when he did. Morning light revealed the true isolation of Ezekiel's homestead, a deliberate remoteness that had been his refuge for years, now transformed into a tactical vulnerability. The cabin sat exposed on a gentle rise, visible from all approaches, with only scattered junipers and the small shed offering any additional cover. In the harsh clarity of daylight, Ezekiel assessed their position with the practiced eye of a former scout and found it sorely lacking. He worked methodically, moving water barrels inside, reinforcing shutters, and calculating sightlines from each window. Morning Star watched him briefly before joining the preparations without being asked. She gathered stones from the creek bed, piling them strategically by the windows as makeshift barriers. Her movements were efficient, despite her condition, conserving energy while accomplishing each task with quiet precision. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly. Ezekiel wiped sweat from his brow as he finished securing the corral gate. He'd considered releasing Mercy, giving the horse a chance to escape the coming conflict, but decided against it. If they needed to flee, the mare would be their only hope. Inside the cabin, Morningstar had rearranged the furniture to create defensive positions. The table was upended against one wall, the trunk dragged beneath the window. She'd found his meager medical supplies and organized them on a shelf within easy reach. Now, she sat cross-legged on the floor, methodically checking the ammunition he'd laid out and sorting it by type. "You've done this before," Ezekiel observed, filling a canteen at the pump. Morningstar glanced up. "He," she confirmed. "Yes." Then, struggling with English, "Many fights? Many? Running?" Ezekiel nodded. He'd heard rumors over the years how Black Thunder's band had become experts at evading army patrols, setting ambushes, and disappearing into territory other tribes feared to enter. They were survivors in a world determined to eliminate them. He sat across from her, his old bones protesting the hard floor. After a moment's hesitation, he reached for his journal and a pencil. "Your husband?" he asked, making a simple drawing of a man beside a woman. Morningstar studied the crude sketch, then shook her head. "Nehames, not husband." She touched her stomach. Father, dead now." Ezekiel's brow furrowed. "The baby's father is dead. How?" She seemed to understand his confusion. With careful movements, she took the pencil and drew a rough outline of a tipi. Next to it, she drew several stick figures, then violently scribbled over them. She pointed to the scribbles. "Soldiers." "I'm sorry," Ezekiel said softly. Morningstar's expression remained stoic, but her eyes held unfathomable depths of grief. "Heovetsa," she said. "It happened." Then, with visible effort to find the right words, "He's son of great man." "Medicine man, father want..." She gestured to her belly, then made a rocking motion with her arms, like cradling an infant. "One baby, very important." Ezekiel began to understand. "The child carries important bloodlines, for your tribe's future." She nodded, relief crossing her features at being understood. "Father angry, very angry." She made a slashing motion across her throat. "Ma kill all who take me." The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Black Thunder wasn't just coming to rescue his daughter, he was coming to ensure his grandchild, possibly the last of an important lineage, survived. And he would destroy anything or anyone that stood in his way. "Why trust me?" Ezekiel asked suddenly. "I'm white, like the soldiers." Morningstar considered him for a long moment. "Not same," she finally said. She tapped her chest, then her temple. See here, you different." She hesitated, then added, "You have ve hoe meshkeso," white man's sadness. The phrase struck him like a physical blow, so simple yet profound in its assessment. White man's sadness, the burden of witnessing his own people's cruelty and doing nothing to stop it. "Will your father listen?" Ezekiel asked. As if I tried to explain. Morningstar's expression darkened. "Maybe no listen, maybe just kill." Ezekiel nodded, accepting this reality with the calm of a man who had long ago made peace with his mortality. "Then we prepare as best we can." They worked through the afternoon, communicating in their developing blend of English, Cheyenne, and gestures. As the language barrier slowly eroded, Ezekiel learned more about her, that she was 19 summers old, that she had been a healer in training before being captured, that her mother had died years earlier during a harsh winter. In turn, he found himself sharing pieces of his own life, his childhood in Pennsylvania, his time as a scout, his brief marriage to a woman who had died of fever before they could have children. He didn't speak of the massacre that had driven him to desert, but somehow he sensed that Morning Star understood that shaped hole in his narrative. As evening approached, Ezekiel prepared a more substantial meal than usual. Venison stew with the last of his potatoes and dried corn. They ate in companionable silence, the shared labor of the day having forged something neither of them had expected: respect. After the meal, Morning Star motioned for him to sit on the floor in front of her. When he complied, puzzled, she moved behind him and began to work her fingers through his silver-streaked hair, separating it into sections. "What are you doing?" he asked, stiffening slightly. "Warrior hair," she explained, continuing to plait his long hair into a single tight braid. "For fight good." The simple intimacy of the gesture caught Ezekiel off guard. No one had touched him with such care in decades. He remained still, allowing her this ritual preparation, understanding it was as much for her benefit as his. A way of transforming this weathered white man into someone her father might hesitate to kill on sight. When she finished, she came around to inspect her work, nodding with satisfaction. Then, unexpectedly, she placed her palm against his chest, over his heart. "Brave man," she said solemnly. "Good man." Ezekiel covered her hand with his own, weathered and calloused against her smooth skin. No words seemed adequate. So he offered none, just the silent promise that whatever came with the dawn, she would not face it alone. Dawn broke with ominous silence. No birdsong greeted the new day, no chittering of squirrels or distant howl of coyotes, just the eerie quiet of wilderness holding its breath. Ezekiel recognized the stillness immediately. They were being watched. He moved away from the window without drawing the shutter, careful not to silhouette himself against the early light. Morning Star was already awake, sitting motionless on the edge of the cot, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. Their eyes met in wordless communication. She felt it too. "How many?" Ezekiel whispered, holding up his hands in question. Morning Star closed her eyes briefly, as if listening to something beyond the cabin walls. "3, she replied softly. "Maybe 4. Scouts, then. Not the main party, not Black Thunder himself, not yet." Ezekiel weighed their options. They could barricade themselves inside, hope the scouts merely observed and departed. They could attempt to flee, though with Morning Star's condition and just one horse, they wouldn't get far. Or they could face this first contact directly, perhaps shaping what would follow. "We need to talk to them," he decided, "before they report back." Morning Star's eyes widened in surprise. "They kill you," she warned. "Maybe," Ezekiel conceded, "but hiding only delays the inevitable. If your father is coming with warriors, no defense I make will hold." She studied him intently, measuring his resolve. "Why you do this? Why you help me?" It was a fair question, one he'd asked himself repeatedly since that moment in Redemption Creek. The answer came more easily than he expected. "Because 30 years ago, I looked away when I should have acted," he said simply. "I'm not looking away this time." Something shifted in her expression, a deepening of respect, perhaps, or recognition of a shared understanding that transcended their different worlds. She nodded once, decision made. "I go first," she said. "Show them I live, not hurt." Ezekiel wanted to object, but recognized the wisdom in her approach. Her people needed to see she was unharmed, free to move and speak. He was the stranger here, the enemy in their eyes. "All right," he agreed, "but I'll be right behind you." They moved deliberately, without weapons. Ezekiel left his rifle propped against the wall, taking only his old hunting knife, which he placed visibly in its sheath. Morning Star changed into the clean buckskin dress he'd purchased for her in town. arranging her long hair in the traditional style of her people, adorned with a single eagle feather she'd found among his possessions. Before opening the door, she turned to him. "If they attack," she said carefully, "you run." "Not wait for me." Ezekiel shook his head. "That's not going to happen." "Promise," she insisted, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. "My father not kill me. But you..." She drew her finger across her throat in the universal gesture. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," he replied, avoiding the promise she sought. Morning Star's eyes flashed with frustration, but there was no more time for argument. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped into the morning light. Ezekiel followed a few paces behind, his hands visible at his sides, back straight, despite every instinct screaming at him to seek cover. The yard before the cabin appeared empty, but he knew better. His eyes swept the tree line, the rock outcropping to the east, the shallow depression near the corral where a man could lie concealed. Morning Star stood tall, her chin lifted proudly as she called out in Cheyenne. Her voice carried across the clearing, strong and clear. "No takseve hoe, na oke seme, na tse okiamaheo, oh." "My people, I see you. Show yourselves." For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then, movement rippled through the tall grass near the eastern edge of the property. A figure rose, a young warrior, perhaps 17, his face streaked with red and black paint, a bow held loosely in his hands. Two more emerged in quick succession, one from behind the shed, another from the rocks. The first warrior took a step forward, his eyes fixed on Morning Star with naked relief. "Morning Star, ne esevu matse." "We found you." She responded in rapid Cheyenne, words Ezekiel couldn't follow, gesturing occasionally toward him. The warriors' expressions darkened as they glanced his way, hands tightening on their weapons. The oldest of the three, a man with a scarred face and hard eyes, barked something that made Morning Star's back stiffen. She replied sharply, one hand moving to her belly in what seemed a protective gesture. Ezekiel remained perfectly still, understanding that any sudden movement could provoke violence. These men were coiled with tension, ready to release arrows at the slightest provocation. Whatever Morning Star was telling them, it was keeping them from attacking, for now. The scarred warrior spoke again, pointing eastward, then making a chopping motion with his hand. Morning Star shook her head firmly. The young warrior who had first appeared tried to interject, but the older man silenced him with a gesture. Then, unexpectedly, Morning Star turned and beckoned Ezekiel forward. He hesitated, reading the warning in the warrior's postures, but trusted her judgment. With slow, deliberate steps, he moved to her side, keeping his hands visible. "This Ezekiel," she said in English, before repeating what must have been his name in Cheyenne. "He saved me. From bad men, he friend." The scarred warrior spat on the ground, clearly unconvinced. "Ave hoe honoveho eokahatsa hatsa." "White devil, he lies." Morning Star's response was heated, her gestures emphatic. She pointed to Ezekiel repeatedly, then to her unbound wrists, then to the cabin. Finally, she stepped directly in front of him, a clear message that to harm him, they would have to go through her first. The standoff stretched, tension crackling in the air like summer lightning. Finally, the scarred warrior made a curt gesture to his companions. The youngest warrior looked conflicted, glancing between Morning Star and his leader with obvious distress, but ultimately followed the others as they backed slowly toward the trees. "What did you tell them?" Ezekiel asked when they disappeared from view. "Truth," Morning Star replied. "You buy me, free me, protect me." She paused, looking troubled. "They not believe. Think you keep me, use me, Ezekiel understood. In their experience, what white man would help a native woman without expecting something in return? "They go tell my father now," she continued. "Tell him I hear. Tell him—" She hesitated. "White man has me." "Will they tell him you're unharmed, that you defended me?" Morning Star's eyes were troubled. "Red Hawk, Leader 1, he hate all white men, his family killed by soldiers. He tell truth, but with poison. And the young one, he seemed to know you." A shadow crossed her face. "Young wolf. He was to be my husband. After—" She touched her belly, unable to complete the thought. Ezekiel absorbed this new information, understanding the layers of complexity that surrounded her situation. Not just a chief's daughter, but a woman promised to another man, carrying the child of one who had died. "What now?" he asked. Morning Star turned to face the eastern horizon, as if she could already see the dust of approaching riders. "Now we wait," she said grimly. "Father comes soon, today maybe, with many warriors, very angry. And when he arrives, what will you do?" She met his gaze steadily, conflict evident in her dark eyes. "I not know," she admitted. "Father is mevetanoham, stubborn, proud." "May not listen," Ezekiel nodded, accepting the uncertainty of their situation. They had made their first move, neither fleeing nor fighting, but standing their ground with truth as their only weapon. Now, they could only wait to see how Black Thunder would respond. As they returned to the cabin, Ezekiel noticed Morning Star glancing back toward where young Wolf had disappeared. A flicker of something like longing crossing her features before she squared her shoulders and stepped inside. They came with the afternoon sun at their backs, emerging from the eastern horizon like vengeful spirits, first just specks in the distance, then taking form as riders moving with single-minded purpose across the open plain. Even from afar, Ezekiel could see they made no attempt at concealment or stealth. This was not a raid, but a reckoning, announced with the full confidence of overwhelming force. Ezekiel counted at least 30 warriors as they approached, though dust clouds suggested more followed behind. At their center rode a figure whose very posture commanded attention, a man sitting taller than the others upon a magnificent paint stallion, eagle feathers adorning his long braids, a red-streaked face set in lines of grim determination. "Black Thunder," Ezekiel murmured, recognizing the war chief from descriptions in long-ago military dispatches. Morning Star stood beside him on the porch, one hand braced against a support post, the other pressed to the small of her back. Her face revealed a complex storm of emotions: relief at seeing her father alive, fear for what might follow, uncertainty about where her loyalties should now lie. "He very angry," she said quietly. "I see in how he rides." Ezekiel nodded, recognizing the battle posture of the approaching war party. "What will you do?" he asked, watching her carefully. Morning Star took a deep breath. "Stand between," she said with simple dignity. "Father not attack if I there." Ezekiel wasn't so certain. He had seen men consumed by vengeance before, blind to everything but their target. Still, he would not hide behind her skirts. "We face him together," he decided. "Then we'll show him respect, but not fear." Morning Star gave him a look of surprise, then something that might have been approval. "Together," she agreed. They stepped off the porch as the riders approached, standing side by side in the open yard. Ezekiel had removed his gun belt earlier, leaving it hanging by the door, a calculated risk. His knife remained at his hip, and his rifle stood propped against the wall within reach, but he presented himself unarmed, hands empty at his sides. The war party halted about 50 yards from the cabin, forming a wide semicircle. Warriors with rifles raised them to shoulders, arrows were knocked to bowstrings, all aimed at Ezekiel. The message was clear: one wrong move, and he would fall beneath a hail of projectiles. Black Thunder rode forward alone, his stallion prancing sideways with barely contained energy. Up close, the chief was even more imposing, tall and broad-shouldered despite his years, with a face like weathered granite and eyes that burned with the intensity of banked coals. A long scar ran from temple to jaw on one side of his face, pulling his mouth into a permanent half-snarl. Across his chest, he wore a breastplate of bone and bead, and at his side hung a tomahawk that had clearly tasted blood. "Nemihone!" Morning Star called out, using the formal address for father. Black Thunder's eyes flickered to his daughter, registering her condition, her apparent health, the way she stood unbound and unafraid. Something like relief crossed his features before being subsumed again by cold fury. He spoke sharply in Cheyenne, gesturing for her to come to him. Morning Star shook her head, replying with equal firmness. She remained rooted beside Ezekiel. The chief's expression darkened. He barked another command, this one clearly a demand rather than a request. When Morning Star again refused, murmurs rippled through the assembled warriors. Young Wolf, visible now among the riders, looked stricken by her defiance. Black Thunder's gaze shifted to Ezekiel, hatred radiating from him in almost palpable waves. He spoke directly to him, the words incomprehensible, but their meaning clear from his tone and the chopping gesture he made across his throat. Ezekiel stood his ground, meeting the chief's eyes without flinching. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his right hand, palm outward in the universal gesture of peace. "And I mean no harm to your daughter or your people," he said, knowing the words themselves wouldn't be understood, but hoping their intent might be. "Morning Star is free to go with you." Morning Star quickly translated, her voice steady despite the tension vibrating in the air. Black Thunder's response was immediate and scathing. He gestured to Ezekiel, then to Morning Star's belly, making accusations clear even without translation. Morning Star's face flushed with anger. She fired back rapidly in Cheyenne, occasionally pointing to the town, to Ezekiel, to herself. She lifted her wrists, showing they were unbound, then gestured to the cabin with its open door. Finally, she placed a hand on Ezekiel's arm, a deliberate show of trust that caused several warriors to raise their weapons higher. "What are you telling him?" Ezekiel asked quietly. "Truth," she replied without taking her eyes from her father. "You save me from slave men. You bring me here. You protect me, you good man." Black Thunder was unmoved. He barked another command, this time signaling to two warriors, who immediately dismounted and started toward Morning Star, clearly intending to retrieve her by force, if necessary. Ezekiel tensed, but made no move toward his weapons. Morning Star, however, stepped forward, her hand raised in command with such authority that the warriors actually hesitated. "Ehese Hatse!" she called out. "Stop!" To Ezekiel's surprise, they did, looking uncertainly to their chief for direction. Black Thunder's face contorted with rage. He swung down from his horse with the agility of a much younger man, landing with barely a sound despite his impressive size. With deliberate steps, he advanced until he stood just yards away, close enough for Ezekiel to see the flecks of gray in his braids, the old bullet scars on his chest, the ceremonial markings painted across his forehead. The chief's hand moved to his tomahawk, fingers curling around its worn handle as he spoke again, his voice a low rumble of controlled fury. Morning Star stepped between them, her back straight, chin lifted in defiance. "Father says she translated, her voice barely above a whisper. "He says he will take my baby from your corpse if he must." Time seemed to suspend itself in that moment, the chief's hand on his weapon, morning star between them, warriors poised to unleash death at their leader's command. Ezekiel felt an odd calm settle over him, the certainty of impending violence bringing clarity rather than fear. "Tell your father," Ezekiel said quietly to Morning Star, "that I understand his anger. Any man would feel the same." She translated, her voice steady despite the trembling Ezekiel could feel where her shoulder brushed his arm. Black Thunder's expression didn't change, but he had not yet drawn his tomahawk, a small mercy. "Tell him," Ezekiel continued, "that I've seen too many die in wars between our peoples. I won't add to that count if I can help it." As Morning Star relayed his words, Ezekiel slowly, very slowly reached down and unsheathed his knife. Black Thunder's body tensed, his warriors raised their weapons. But Ezekiel immediately turned the blade, holding it by the tip, handle extended toward the chief. "This was my father's knife," he said, "and his father's before him. I offer it freely, as a token of my respect," Morning Star translated, adding something of her own that Ezekiel couldn't understand. Black Thunder's eyes narrowed, suspicion warring with the ingrained protocol of gift exchange that governed tribal diplomacy. After a long moment, he took the knife, examining it with the eye of a man who understood good steel. He spoke a single word, a question from his tone. "Why?" Morning Star translated. It was the question at the heart of everything. Why had Ezekiel involved himself in this? Why risk his life for a woman he didn't know, from a people his kind had systematically destroyed? "Because 30 years ago, I was a scout for the army," Ezekiel said, holding the chief's gaze. "I led soldiers to villages. I watched them kill. And I did nothing." As Morning Star translated, her voice caught on certain words, emotion bleeding through her careful control. "I can't undo those days," Ezekiel continued. "But when I saw your daughter being sold like cattle, I couldn't stand by again, not this time." Black Thunder's expression remained granite hard, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of a truth simply spoken. Ezekiel wasn't finished. "Your daughter is free to go with you now. She has been from the moment I cut her chains. I bought her freedom, not her person." While Morning Star translated, he reached into his shirt and withdrew a folded paper, the bill of sale from Harlan's trading post. With deliberate movements, he tore it in half, then in quarters, letting the pieces fall to the dust between them. A murmur ran through the gathered warriors. Even those who couldn't understand his words could read the significance of the gesture. Black Thunder studied him for a long moment, then spoke at length, his deep voice rising and falling in the cadences of formal oratory. "My father says," Morning Star translated, "that a white man's words are like smoke. They disappear in the wind. He has heard promises before from men with forked tongues. Why should he believe you now?" It was a fair question, one Ezekiel had anticipated. His response was simple. "I don't ask him to believe my words. I ask him to judge my actions." As Morning Star relayed this, something unexpected happened. Young Wolf, the warrior who had been promised to Morning Star, urged his horse forward to Black Thunder's side. He spoke rapidly, gesturing toward the surrounding area, then to Morning Star herself. What's he saying?" Ezekiel whispered. "He tells what he saw," Morning Star replied. "That cabin not like fort, no many guns, that you could have hurt me, but I am well, that you face Black Thunder with no weapon." The chief listened to young Wolf without interruption, his face revealing nothing. When the young warrior finished, Black Thunder dismissed him with a curt nod, then returned his attention to Ezekiel. "There is still the matter of who took my daughter," he said through Morning Star, "who raided my village and killed our people. Will you claim no responsibility for your kind's actions?" "I claim no kinship with those men," Ezekiel replied firmly. "The ones who took your daughter are the same ones who would have owned her if I hadn't intervened. They're not my people any more than a wolf is brother to a dog." As Morning Star translated, Ezekiel saw Red Hawk, the scarred warrior from the scouting party, push his way forward through the line of mounted men. He called out something harsh and accusatory, pointing at Ezekiel with naked hatred. Black Thunder raised a hand, silencing him without looking back. "Red Hawk says you lie," Morning Star explained quietly, "that all white men are same. That you must die for crimes against our people." Ezekiel nodded his understanding. He had expected nothing less. Black Thunder studied him with penetrating intensity, as if trying to see into his soul. Finally, he spoke again, this time directly addressing his daughter. Morning Star's eyes widened at whatever he said. She responded heatedly, one hand moving protectively to her belly. The exchange grew more intense, voices rising though neither gave ground. Finally, Black Thunder raised his hand again, cutting off further argument. He turned to his warriors and issued what was clearly an order. To Ezekiel's surprise, the men lowered their weapons, though they did not put them away completely. "And my father wishes to know," Morning Star said, her voice tight with controlled emotion, "if you would share meat and fire with him to speak of these matters further." It was not peace, not yet, but it was a reprieve, a willingness to parley rather than execute immediate vengeance. In the language of the frontier, the invitation to share food was significant, a sacred obligation on both sides. Sunset painted the sky in violent hues of crimson and gold as Ezekiel built the fire in the yard between his cabin and the assembled warriors. He worked methodically, arranging the wood in the traditional cross pattern he'd learned decades ago from a Pawnee scout, aware that every movement was scrutinized by dozens of eyes that still saw him as enemy. Black Thunder had dismissed most of his warriors to make camp at a respectful distance, retaining only 5 men, Red Hawk, Young Wolf, and 3 others whose names Ezekiel didn't know. They sat in a loose semicircle, weapons within reach, but not in hand, their faces impassive in the gathering dusk. Inside the cabin, Morning Star prepared what little food Ezekiel had to offer: venison from his last hunt, beans, coffee. Her movements were precise, almost ceremonial, as she arranged portions on his mismatched plates. This was more than a meal. It was a diplomatic exchange with rules as rigid as any European court. "Your father could still decide to kill me after we eat," Ezekiel remarked quietly as she worked. Morning Star glanced up from her task. "Could," she agreed, "but break bread first." "Then maybe not want to. Is that how it works?" Ezekiel asked, managing a thin smile. "Sometimes," she replied, her own lips curving slightly. "Hope so." When she brought the food outside, she served her father first, then the other warriors, then Ezekiel, and finally herself, a clear statement of hierarchy that Ezekiel understood was deliberate. The message, her father was still her chief, deserving first honor. They ate in silence initially, the crackling fire and distant calls of nighthawks the only sounds. Ezekiel observed how Black Thunder handled his food with dignity but also the practical efficiency of a man who had known hunger. Not so different from himself in that regard, it was the chief who eventually broke the silence, speaking directly to Ezekiel while Morning Star translated. "My daughter says you were a scout. That you hunted my people for the bluecoats." Ezekiel nodded, not denying it. For 5 years, along the Powder River and east to the Black Hills. Why did you stop? The question was direct, cutting to the heart of things as Ezekiel had come to expect from the chief. He considered how to answer, aware that his response might determine whether he lived to see morning. I watched a massacre at Bear Creek, he said finally. The women and children killed. The village had done nothing. They were peaceful, had even traded at the fort, but the lieutenant wanted blood, said it would send a message. Morning Star translated carefully, her voice steady, though her eyes revealed her reaction to his words. And you, Black Thunder asked, did you kill that day? No, Ezekiel replied, meeting the chief's gaze across the fire. But I didn't stop it either. I just sat on my horse and watched. Sometimes that's the same as pulling the trigger. When Morning Star finished translating, a heavy silence fell. Black Thunder studied Ezekiel, firelight reflecting in his dark eyes before speaking again. The men who took my daughter, he said, tell me of them. Ezekiel described Harlan, the Cobb brothers, and others he'd seen at the trading post. He explained how they operated on the fringes of law, protected by bribes to corrupt officials and the general indifference of townsfolk who looked the other way. They're raiders, not soldiers, Ezekiel concluded. They attack isolated villages, take what they can carry, and sell people to the highest bidder. The army doesn't sanction it, but they don't stop it either. Black Thunder absorbed this information with a face like stone. When he responded, his voice had deepened with barely contained rage. They killed 19 of my people, he said. Elders, women, 2 children. They took 6 captives. My daughter is the only one we have found alive. Ezekiel felt the familiar weight of shame pressing down on him, not personal guilt for this specific atrocity, but the broader shame of his race's actions against these people. And to the others might have been sold elsewhere, he suggested. Santa Fe, maybe Denver. Black Thunder's expression darkened further. Then they are lost to us, he said. But those who took them, they must answer for this blood. Ezekiel considered his next words carefully, aware he was stepping onto dangerous ground. What are you planning, Chief? The question hung in the air like gun smoke. Red Hawk muttered something that sounded like a challenge, but Black Thunder silenced him with a glance before answering. Justice, he said simply. Blood for blood. Morning Star spoke then, not translating but offering her own thoughts in rapid Cheyenne. From her gestures and the intensity of her voice, Ezekiel gathered she was arguing against whatever her father intended. Black Thunder responded sharply, pointing toward Redemption Creek. Their exchange grew heated, with Morning Star occasionally switching to English, perhaps deliberately, Ezekiel realized, so that he could understand parts of her argument. Not all guilty, she insisted. Children there, women, innocent ones. No innocent, they, her, Red Hawk interjected bitterly. All take our land, all kill our people. Ezekiel cleared his throat, drawing their attention. If you ride into Redemption Creek looking for vengeance, you'll find it, along with a dozen rifles waiting for you, he said bluntly. The town will be expecting trouble after what happened with your daughter. They'll shoot first and count the dead later. Morning Star translated, adding her own emphatic nod. And what would you suggest instead, Scout? Black Thunder asked, using the title as both acknowledgement and subtle reminder of Ezekiel's past. On justice, Ezekiel echoed, but targeted Harlan, the Cobb brothers, Wilson, who would have bought your daughter if I hadn't. Those men, not the whole town. A spark of interest flickered in the chief's eyes. And how would this be done? I know where they live, their habits, Ezekiel explained. I could help you find them, isolate them. But only if you give me your word that no innocent blood will be shed. Morningstar's eyes widened as she translated, clearly surprised by his offer. Black Thunder considered this proposal, his expression unreadable. Why would you betray your own kind? They're not my kind, Ezekiel repeated firmly. And the men who trade in human flesh, who murder for profit, they're nothing to me. The chief studied him for a long moment, then spoke to Morningstar directly. She responded with what sounded like reluctance, glancing at Ezekiel with worry evident in her eyes. My father asks if you would swear this oath on your life. She finally translated, if innocent blood is shed, your life is forfeit. Ezekiel nodded without hesitation. And I accept those terms. Young Wolf suddenly spoke up, addressing Black Thunder with respectful but insistent tones. Whatever he said caused the other warriors to exchange glances, some nodding in agreement. What's he saying? Ezekiel asked Morningstar quietly. He says, better plan than war on town, she whispered. Says many warriors would die in such a fight. Says better to punish guilty ones only. Black Thunder listened to Young Wolf's counsel with greater patience than he'd shown Red Hawk, suggesting the young warrior held some special status despite his youth. When Young Wolf finished, the chief turned back to Ezekiel. If we do this thing, he said, what becomes of my daughter? The question caught Ezekiel off guard. She's free to return with you, of course. That was never in question. Black Thunder's gaze was penetrating, and if she chooses otherwise, Ezekiel glanced at Morningstar, whose face had gone carefully blank. That would be her decision, he said carefully. Not mine to make. Something that might have been approval flickered briefly across the chief's weathered features. He rose to his feet, signaling an end to the discussion. We will speak again at dawn, he announced. I must consult with my warriors. Dawn arrived with a clarity that seemed almost deliberate, the sky washing clean of clouds to reveal a perfect azure canvas stretching from horizon to horizon. Ezekiel stood on his porch, watching as Black Thunder emerged from his council, walking with the measured dignity that seemed as much a part of him as his braided hair or scarred face. The night had passed without incident, no attempt on Ezekiel's life, no warriors slipping away toward Redemption Creek. A fragile trust had held through the darkness, though Ezekiel harbored no illusions about its durability. Black Thunder approached alone, his face set in solemn lines. When he reached the porch, he nodded once, not quite respect, but acknowledgement. I have consulted with my warriors, he said through Morningstar, who had appeared silently at Ezekiel's side. We accept your proposal. Justice for the guilty, peace for the innocent. Ezekiel released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. I'll help you find Harlan and the others, but after, you must leave this territory. The army will come if there's bloodshed, no matter how justified. When Morningstar translated, Black Thunder's eyes hardened, but he nodded his acceptance. We go north after, to the big mountains, where the white man's reach is not yet long. When do we move against Harlan? Ezekiel asked. 3 days, Black Thunder replied. We prepare, watch the town. Learn their movements. It was a sound strategy, one that spoke to the chief's experience as a military leader. Ezekiel found himself respecting the man's tactical thinking, despite the grim purpose behind it. And Morningstar? Ezekiel asked, the question that had lingered unspoken through the night. What of her? Black Thunder's eyes shifted to his daughter, softening almost imperceptibly. She carries our future, he said. The child of our medicine man's son, she returns with us to safety until the birth. Morningstar had not translated this last exchange, her eyes downcast as her father spoke of her fate. When she finally looked up, There was a quiet determination in her gaze that Ezekiel had come to recognize. "Father," she said in Cheyenne, before switching to halting English, clearly intending Ezekiel to understand, "I stay here." Until after, Black Thunder's expression darkened. "Monesh Yanuhe, no. Birth comes soon," she insisted, placing her hand on her swollen belly. 2, maybe 3 weeks. Not safe to travel so far, not now." The chief looked to Ezekiel, suspicion flaring. "This is your doing. You told her to stay." "No," Ezekiel replied firmly. "This is the first I'm hearing of it." Morningstar spoke rapidly in Cheyenne, her voice steady despite her father's growing anger. Whatever she said caused Black Thunder to fall silent, his eyes measuring her with new consideration. "What did you tell him?" Ezekiel asked when she finished. "I tell him truth," she replied simply. "That I am daughter of Black Thunder. That I make own choice. That child I carry needs peace to be born strong." She turned back to her father, adding something that made his stern face soften marginally. "I promise I come north," she explained to Ezekiel. "After child born, after justice done, I ask Father to leave young Wolf with me for protection." Black Thunder studied both of them, his gaze piercing as if searching for deception. Finally, he nodded once, sharply. "Young Wolf stays," he confirmed. "Until the child comes, then both return to our people." Relief washed over Morningstar's features, though she quickly composed herself. "Nea eshe nemeone." "Thank you, Father." Black Thunder reached out, placing a weathered hand on his daughter's cheek in a gesture of surprising tenderness. Then he turned to Ezekiel, his expression hardening once more. "If harm comes to her under your roof," he said, "no distance will save you. No mountain high enough to hide you. I will find you, and your death will be slow." "I understand," Ezekiel replied, meeting the chief's gaze without flinching. "I gave my word. I'll keep it." Black Thunder held his gaze for a long moment, then extended his hand in the white man's gesture of agreement. Ezekiel clasped it firmly, feeling the strength in the older man's grip. With arrangements made for the coming days, Black Thunder departed to relay orders to his warriors. Young Wolf would remain behind, camping near the cabin but not inside it, close enough to protect Morningstar, distant enough to preserve propriety. As the main party of warriors prepared to withdraw to a more secluded location to await the planned justice, Ezekiel found himself standing alone with Morningstar at the edge of his property. "Do I stay?" he asked quietly. "You could be with your people now, safe." Morningstar looked toward the horizon, where her father's riders were already disappearing into the morning haze. "You save me," she said simply. "Now I save you." "Save me from what?" "From yourself," she replied, turning to face him fully. From being alone with ghosts." Ezekiel felt something shift within him, a loosening of a knot that had been bound tight for 30 years. This young woman, who had every reason to hate him for his race if nothing else, had seen something in him worth preserving. "What happens after?" he asked. "After the child is born? After what's to come with Harlan and the others?" Morningstar placed a hand on her belly, her expression thoughtful. "For 2 worlds now," she said. "My child belonged to both. Need bridge between." She looked up at him, her dark eyes holding his. "Maybe you be that bridge." Ezekiel didn't respond immediately, the weight of her words settling over him like a mantle, not a burden but a purpose, something he had lacked for too many years. As they walked back toward the cabin, Morningstar slightly ahead, with the unconscious grace that even her pregnancy couldn't diminish. Ezekiel realized that in trying to save her, he had found something he thought lost forever, a future worth living for. Behind them, the sun climbed higher, casting their shadows before them. Two figures from different worlds, walking the same path toward an uncertain but shared tomorrow.